welcome. I'm very, very excited. I'm really pleased to be here in this section of the Welcome to the Afrofuture program, which is being curated by Tomiwa Folorunso and Natasha Ruona. In this conversation, we're going to sort of frame ourselves within the very broad question of what Afrofuturism is. I'd like to introduce the guests. We have, I'll give you a one-line bio and then say a little bit about each person. And so in Khadea, we have a maker and a doer. We have a practicing artist and a connector. Khadea is an artist and producer who's based in Edinburgh, graduated from the Edinburgh College's Contemporary Art Practice course, has worked on a number of projects with communities that explore oral histories and embodied knowledge. She's a member of the committee at Rubaba Gallery and Studios and works collaboratively on new programs, including From Tomorrow's Yesterdays and Rubaba's podcast series. And you can find Khadea's information on Instagram as well. You can have all of that information after we finish. Then we have Mae, a writer, spoken word artist, and curator based in Aberdeen. I'll say a little bit about Mae, a Black queer spoken word artist, co-founder of intersectional feminist arts platform, Hysteria, and one of Scottish Black and Minority Ethnic Writers Network's program managers. She's been published by Fall for Ink magazine and created work for the National Library of Scotland, Stanza, and Fringe of Colour films. And last but not least, we have Tanatsei, an artist and producer, Edinburgh-based. And we're going to enjoy looking at the term Afrofuturism from the point of view of the continent, as well as from the point of view of the diaspora, where there are obvious differences. Tanatsei is a post-disciplinary artist and cultural practitioner working transnationally. Her interests lie in creating socially engaged and inventive experiences that center justice, joy, and care. Tanatsei's work emerges through literary and text-based media, as well as participatory forms involving facilitation and producing in community. With indigeneity and anti-coloniality at the center of her practice, she draws from personal experience, exploring methods of post-independence culture making in Black and global South contexts. She's a geographer and historian at heart, taking a research-based approach to her work. So those are our three brilliant panelists, and my name is Clementine Burnley, and I am a feminist writer, community organizer, mother in Edinburgh, and I've been published with various publications which you can find on the internet. I'm active with Obsidian Foundation, and I've done work for the Edwin Morgan Second Life Grant, and I'm doing some work now for the Africa in Motion Film Festival, which I just wanted to mention very briefly. Okay, so those are the introductions. I'm going to be quiet in a moment. I'll ask the first question and I'll let you all weigh in on that. So I've spoken quite a lot about each of you. The first thing that I'm really interested in is how you arrived at this point, actually, in your work, in your practice, in your activism. Could you share with us, in turn, what you find relevant about your journey to this point?
We're all very polite. I'll just dive in.
Jump in, Mae.
So I think a lot of where I've kind of ended up has, I think the word accident is the main word that kind of leaps out in bold to me. I kind of find out who I am and what I'm wanting to do and what I'm good at. It seems to be purely by accident. So a few years ago, I found out that I quite liked spoken word. You know, having never had any desire to get up on a stage and perform spoken word, it just so happened that my friend had a slot at a gig. He couldn't go, so I thought, you know what, I'll just do it. And I wrote something in about a day, and then the next day I got up and performed it, and that was it. I just felt there was this kind of magic on the stage, and there was a real. I knew that I hadn't realized that that poem had been inside me, and I'd figured out how to pull it out, how to create that, and then how to share that and communicate my experience and feelings with an audience, which was fantastic. I was like, wow, why have I never done this before? So that, you know, that was kind of that was a few years ago. But before then, I'd always, you know, I was a musical theatre kid. I always liked being on stage. You know, I played instruments. I liked dancing. I liked writing. I'd planned so many. I think by the age of 12, I'd planned so many fantasy novels, like the first chapter, and never written anything down. So I always had this kind of creativity, but I wasn't able to channel it. But it's really just kind of been in recent years that I've found a niche, and I found a space where I feel comfortable doing that. I've also found community as well, which is why I'm here today. And that's something that's happened really kind of in the last year or two as well, that by meeting other Black artists, by meeting other Black queer artists in Scotland, I've made so many great connections, and I've kind of just started to find out that there's actually so much going on, and there are conversations like these that are happening kind of everywhere, it seems. And so, yeah, by accident, I feel it feels like by accident, but it also feels very correct. Yeah, so I guess that's my journey to this Zoom room, literally.
Fascinating. Who connects to that? Which of you wants to jump in then in response?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. I think much like Mae, my childhood was very much about dancing and theatre, and I was involved with a dance company and with the National Theatre Company in Harare, which is where I was born and raised. But I found as I grew older that so much of kind of the creative industry in Harare was still very much dominated, I think, by white folk, by white descendants of settler colonialists in the country. And I think I didn't have a language. Now I can identify what that was. But I think at the time when I was young, I had this, I think it's such a strange thing, right? Zimbabwe is a Black majority country, but of course we have a colonial history. And the small white settler population that's still in the country is still very much wealthier than the Black majority. And so it was such a strange experience for me to feel like a minority in a place where racially I'm a majority. But that's because, you know, I went to private school and had access to kind of the kinds of opportunities that other young white girls were engaging with. And so I think that's why I moved away from theatre, and that's not actually something I talk about very much, or not even something very present in my life now. And so I moved on to, I think, more quite isolated practices, or becoming a poet and a writer. I started writing when I was 14 and have just recently published my first work. And that's been a real journey, I think, of kind of discovering what it means to have a creative practice as a Black woman for myself. And that's been really special. But of course, because I've always been kind of so interdisciplinary in my practice, that's remained with me. And so I do work that's in producing now, but also because I think I have this background from the continent, where I think so much of what dreaming, the language that's given to kind of dreaming in the future of the continent, is quite colonized, in that it's very much about development speak and thinking about like, what does development look like on the continent, and talking about these very, I think, Eurocentric models or ideas about what infrastructural advancement might look like in different places, and I grew within that. And so I think I've always had this sense of like thinking about where does my practice as an artist, as someone who is involved in culture making, fit in with these ideas of development that are so loud all around me. And before I moved to Edinburgh, I completed a program in African Studies at an institution in South Africa. And that was a really formative experience as well, because I was on this campus with people from all over the African continent exclusively, and we were having these conversations on a daily basis. Some we agreed on, others we didn't agree on, but I think that's definitely been part of my story and has really shaped my practice, which I think, yeah, is now I describe as post-disciplinary, because it's not, it's really difficult to define in the kind of siloed terms of art or culture or this or that, and it's quite widespread, I think.
You've touched on actually some of the things that we're going to be picking up again and deepening in the rest of our conversation. So I'm fascinated to hear what you're going to say to us. What brought you to the point we find ourselves in this conversation now, Khadea?
I relate to both of the points, and I can like see my journey sort of like reaching similar points. For me, I started thinking about like identity and like myself in a really fractured way, because at first I really like connected to this idea of, or not by choice, connected to this idea of like migrant and like not feeling displaced, and all of the words that came with that, like illegal alien, and all of these words that felt really like sort of like I couldn't reimagine or imagine a different existence out of that. So when I was at college, I went to a college that was like predominantly white here in Edinburgh, and a lot of the lecturers hadn't actually considered bringing any other existence and experiences other than like cubists like Picasso, and or just sort of very limited kind of experience that I couldn't ever see myself reflected in at all. So I would make a lot of work that really felt disconnected. So I made work where I like just very distanced to anything that I felt internally, or like felt like I wanted to make work about. It just felt like a very stagnant kind of pool of like research, people to like talk about it with, like identity and just the future of like, or existence that I was like trying to speak on. And then I actually like used to see Natasha just around the campus, but we were like in different in different times, like we weren't, connected at that point. And then me and the committee at Rhubarber invited Natasha to have a film screening. And that was the first time I like felt like I had some sort of some like roadmap into like thinking about what this, what like people like Sun Ra and Hydrodexica, all of these kind of really interesting but also like formative groups were doing and people. And I realized that I was just sort of like in this like at college it was just this white noise of like not being able to hear like the actual voice or like some story that I couldn't articulate. So I then started to use the text and the reading and the newfound like community through Natasha and everyone that sort of came to the screening. We had like a reading group, and it just was like a very fruitful kind of space where I wasn't like alienated from it, but also it was talking about that alienation through like a very like science fictional kind of, through writing or through making film. So that for me was like, just I'm right at the beginning of it again. Like I'm at a beginning that feels more connected to me or something.
And so that actually brings us on quite organically, because you've all talked about how you came into art and what that means to you. You know, you've mentioned community, network, you've talked about connections and conversations. And somehow that has involved you moving around or looking, seeking those connections. You've talked about displacement and fracture. You mentioned alienation even, and that's translated through these networks to what you're producing now. Khadea, you mentioned science fiction writing and film. Tanatsei, you mentioned whiteness. And so that was going to be a question I wanted you to weigh in on. In terms of your most significant influences, and you've already spoken about how you came into art as children and how you, Tanatsei, positioned yourself then as an individual artist, really, to get away a little bit from a collective which you didn't feel a part of, you know, which had something to do with class position, with wealth, and with power on who dominated the art and culture production. So can you speak to your significant influences and whiteness as a norm in futurism, confronting that really with what the possibilities are of Afrofuturism when placed beside the norms that you encountered and which pushed you to actually look for communities and become active?
I think that to frame kind of how I'm interpreting kind of this idea of whiteness in the notion of Afrofuturism, I think that many African people and many Black people find it difficult for reasons that I'm not blaming us for, reasons that exist for a reason, they're historical. But I think we find it very difficult to visualize or imagine or conceptualize what the future and what success, what rest and what freedom look like outside of what they look like for white people. And I say this because obviously my core belief in my practice is anti-colonial in nature, and a lot of that is about interrogating the logics of coloniality, right, which implicate, you know, the capitalist world that we live in, the heteropatriarchal world that we live in, that kind of privileges the notions of difference, right? The notions of Black versus white, rich versus woman versus man, which are not even categories that have truth in them at all. And I think it's really important that we reckon with the fact that because of the modern world that we live in, we all kind of envision life through the lens of power, through the lens of who has the power to dictate what that future, what that life looks like, which has been historically whiteness. And so I think this, and I see this come up in Afrofuturism, I think, where, for example, one of the very first kind of visual artist who I encountered who works in Africa and in Afrofuturism, and many do this kind of work with this idea of having these Black figures, many kind of taken from archival images of Indigenous Black people, and kind of restructured with images of space and planets and in the stars, and kind of thinking about Black existence as expansive, I think, in many ways, as being beyond Earth and beyond land, I guess, in that sense as well. I think the works are beautiful, and I think ideologically they come from, this idea of that Black existence can be transcendent and can transcend the experience of being Black on the planet. But I also completely I like to also wonder, like, what influences these kinds of conceptualizations. And I think it's seeing in a lot of sci-fi and a lot of fantasy, mainstream to be specific, it's these ideas of like a future in space and a post-Earth future coming up, and I'm not sure to what extent that imagination is integrous to Black people's imagination, if that makes sense, especially considering, I come from Zimbabwe, and I always come back to my personal experience where over 50% of the population is rural. And in thinking of that, I wonder and I question, for people who come from these different kind of demographic contexts, when we think about the future and what being Black in the future looks like, for me, the kind of immediate needs or the immediate desires is having a future, for example, where Black people have security and can experience comfort and can experience having their material needs acknowledged and provided for in very practical terms. And of course, thinking about like technology and science fiction and fantasy all come into the practice of dreaming and of imagination. But I think the way I approach Afrofuturism from in a way that I think decenters whiteness for me is in thinking about, I can't talk about Afrofuturism without talking about abolitionist futures, right? Where we abolish prisons and we abolish the police and we abolish institutional entities that weaponize violence and prevent the existence of Black people in the future, literally by death, and genocide of all kinds of all different forms. And so I think all this is to say that I think the way that I've managed to, or the way that it's an ongoing practice, I think, of decentering whiteness from my idea of Afrofuturism, is thinking across demographies and across people of different contexts, what are the needs, right? The real needs that people have in order to exist in the future. I hope that made a little bit of sense.
It certainly made sense to me, and I see Mae nodding. Do you want to jump in there and tell us what that sparked for you?
Just the notion of decentering whiteness, I think, particularly speaks to me, because it is something that you actively have to do. I think we really do take for granted how whiteness is the norm. I don't think I knew. I think blackness for me, I had to learn that I was Black. I don't think I was born Black. I think I learned that. I'm not sure about what age, but I grew up in Aberdeen in the mid-90s, which was very, very white. And most of my family were white, and the only Black members of my family were my dad and my siblings. And of course, as a child, you just see your environment, and you just ingest that, and you think, well, this is the reality. So I didn't understand that really what was happening was I was being socialized and growing up in a white environment, and I was identifying with all this whiteness, but with a Black exterior, and without very much connection to my Congolese heritage, or to my dad's lifestyle, and to his heritage. So it was a very kind of strange, and I didn't realize this until I got a lot older, and I sort of looked back and I thought, wow, that that was all a bit weird, actually, kind of growing up that way. So I think that I had to learn what I thought whiteness was, because I think when we talk about decentering whiteness, we said, well, how do you even define that? What does that mean? Does it just mean that you're not the other? And that really, in basic terms, that is what it means. So I think for me, as a Black person, when I imagine what it means to have a Black future, is to have a definition and an understanding of Blackness that isn't based on lack. It isn't based on comparing yourself to the default setting. It's you're sure in what you are and what that means, and growing up, I didn't have that stable sense of identity, because, I would grow up, I'd experience racism, and that's what being Black meant for me, because I was kind of separated from the more positive aspects of, my dad's Congolese culture. So I think it's to move away from, having the universal thing that connects us is, is racism or exploitation. So I think that's, for me, it's not just the decentering of whiteness, it's just, what is whiteness? I don't care. I know what it means to me to be Black. I know the color of my own Blackness. Everybody else's shade, it doesn't matter, because we're not a monolith. So I think it's finding out what that means to you personally, and how that can exist separately from that.
Thank you so much. That has taken us actually into a little bit, not the closing phase of our conversation, but you've all spoken now about the influence of Afrofuturism on what you actually do, and you've even spoken a little bit on what Afrofuturism might allow you to do, and certainly how your growing up into that practice has impacted your ideas of what you might like to use your art for. So before I come to you, Khadea, I just want to ask you if you want to weave in what you've heard already into your response. And I would at the same time invite you, Mae, and you, Tanatsei, to think about significant moments or situations which you would point a young person emerging into Afrofuturism, where you might want to point them. So just hold that last question. And Khadea, do you have thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I think the idea of like what imagining or dreaming could look like for someone who's Black or experiences like anti-Blackness. For me, I guess I always go back to my own lived experience when I'm working with people or with my materials, whatever they might be, like clay or just writing. And I reflect on like my personal story of like how whiteness is like, I like having like having to move throughout the UK or like European countries. Like I grew up in Germany, and just one place, like I think I'm answering a different question, but I'm just gonna go with it. One specific place that really comes to mind is like airports and places where you go off to fly to a different place. And for me, they've always been very like places of trauma, of places of being stopped and places of being like held back and not allowed to like fly with everyone. So for me, Afrofuturism was like a space for me and my siblings, which is maybe like more something I can speak on for the next question, is like a space that we were like all of us were imagining what it would be like to like kind of leave a spaceship, but in our sense, like actually just an airplane, which a lot of people have the privilege of being able to just like go through an airport and travel. I've always, because of my heritage and where I was born, I can't easily travel or leave this country. So for me and my siblings and people that I work with, I like to reimagine or just imagine just a new space, and a space where like the ecological crisis that's going on right now, like thinking of ways to heal that. And yeah, airports are places where I'm like, where I think Afrofuturism can really do a lot in that space where some people aren't able to flee or enter or are stopped. And yeah, that's the thoughts that were going on in my head when Tana was talking about, Tanatsei was talking about just like rest and joy and like a livable future as a Black person. Like it's sometimes like the wildest imagination that I've had is just a more livable kind of circumstance where I can, yeah, that's what was going through my mind when I was just listening to both of you about coming to space and like maybe what Afrofuturism has done for us all to like unlock that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to give that a little bit of time to resonate with me, because actually I found all your answers very moving. So I don't want to rush over the depth of what you've said, because I find really the idea of dreaming, really simple things like moving through an airport, having a livable future, a body that's free from surveillance and control, a body that survives into the future. That's sort of bringing us towards my last questions, really. And then I wanted to say to the audience, if you have questions too of our fantastic panelists, please start to prepare those questions now so that we have the chance to take a look at one or two of them before we close. So my last question, I shall repeat it because, just to be fair, because I'm starting to forget it myself. And what I wanted to find out from you, you've said a lot actually that goes towards answering this question, which was really about where you would point a young person who was looking for their way in Afrofuturism, almost Afrofuturism as a path, as a tool, as a key to open doors. What situations or people which historical periods or influences would you point them towards?
I think we both unmuted.
Yeah, so I was for me, I would say I draw so much inspiration obviously from the lineage of Black or African descent that we all come from. I think to be a racialized person is to have a lineage of ancestors who resist racialization and resist kind of the future that we have been like kind of spurred into, which is actually about stifling Black life. And so the kind of dissent that I'm talking about is, so for example, for a young Zimbabwean person, I would point them to any kind of historical moment or movement, for example, movement towards independence from colonial rule or liberation, as an Afrofuturist moment, as a moment in which Black people imagined that they could self-govern in the wake of colonialism. And of course, I have plenty to say about how we can be critical about independence movements on the African continent and who they served and eventually where they have led us. I think that's a completely different conversation altogether. But I think the premise of what I'm saying is to look at such moments critically, of course, of where Black people have said, here is a moment or an opportunity in which we can fight for our future, fight for a future that is livable, fight for a future that we have ownership over, fight for a future that is equitable and where freedom and care and justice and joy are at the center. I look at the civil rights movement of the 60s in the United States. I look at Black Lives Matter protests that happened just last year here in the UK, which is where I was at the time. These are moments in which I think I draw so much power from, because people who, like myself, have come together and said we deserve better. And there are pathways towards a better future. There are pathways towards ensuring that Black people live on into the future. And also, I think there's so much power in giving testament to the present as well, and the past, and everything we've experienced to lead us into imagining the future. So yeah, I think there's so much strength in community, in that collective action and that those collective practices of dreaming, which they really are, collective practices of dreaming and hoping ourselves into the future.
Thank you. Just carry on, whichever of you wants to jump in.
I think what you said there about ancestors there really spoke to me, because I think that the way that I understand Afrofuturism is it is just about, as much about the past as it is about the future, you know, and it's about how they can inform each other. We can reconstruct a past to reimagine a future, and kind of vice versa. And you know what I was saying earlier when I was talking about how I got to my journey and realized that I had these poems and these stories inside me. We all have stories inside us, and these are just the residual conversations that have been going on for millennia that our ancestors were having. And to take part in that conversation, we have this wonderful thing called art, you know, and we can add to it, and we can reimagine it. And I think Afrofuturism is a brilliant lens to do that, because you are looking to the past to kind of understand the future, to dig out those stories. You know, I think it's one of the things that I am, you know, African American vernacular, AAVE, it's kind of, you know, when people make fun of it, which is quite often, or they mock it, I find that so upsetting, because that is miraculous, the way that African Americans speak, because without realizing it, you know, they are emulating the way that their ancestors, as close to they can speak to their ancestors, because they don't know their names, they don't know their stories, they don't know their culture, but still today, and this isn't Afrofuturism or science fiction today, and that's magic, you know, today they are speaking in those ways, and with doing that from, you know, without understanding how or why. And I think Afrofuturism allows us to do that. We can dig into the past, but also look at what's going on in the future and think, well, I'm actually the living embodiment of the past. You know, we all know the phrase, I'm my ancestor, I don't know who to attribute to, but, you know, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. And so to a young person who was wanting to understand or explore Afrofuturism, I would first say, look inside yourself. You know, first of all, find out what your stories are, find out who your people are, and then go from there. You know, you can look in front and behind at the same time. And that's the beautiful thing, I think, about this, you know, this, I wouldn't say this genre, this movement, this ideology.
Thank you.
I'll jump in now. Both of you, like, I'm just listening and absorbing. It's all really, really like resonating, but also like sparking a lot of thoughts. For me, I worked on a program with Edinburgh Young Carers last April. So we had planned to all meet in person and work on this project that was going to be a science fictional like radio play, and the world had just turned upside down, and a lot of people were experiencing things that people had like lived their whole life experiencing, and a lot of things were coming to surface, or people were more attuned to it. And for me, I was working with I was working with young people to like really ask questions, to like get them to think about a new, or not a new, but just imagine. And for me, I work with two really great young artists who basically reimagined this world called Sokai, and the way that they put themselves into the story, which was different to like, so for them it was like the Black imagination of like having a place where they were like healing, and yeah, so I have a piece of writing that they wrote, which I'll read, because I think their words, using their words, it's much more powerful. So I asked them who the communities on Sokai was and what the life on Sokai was like, and they said that the people here are nervous, surrounded by water but not salty. The communities either fish or they care for floating plants that sustain the water village. And then Jamal, that was Kiana, and then Jamal said, they're like gardeners that we have in this world, but on Sokai they're connected to the plant and the solar energy thing. And I asked them sort of like what would fix the crashes, because they said they described the crashes and ship, and they were talking about like an energy that was older than them, and just the way that they were describing and telling the story really like sounded like a way to heal this, like heal something that's much more deeper, and a trauma that they've not experienced in their lifetime, but would their ancestral lineage would have experienced, to do with this like watery planet, this planet where there was a ship that crashed and like lots of life was lost. But for them, in their language and the way that they talked about it, it didn't have that sort of, it felt much more like emancipationary, like writing, like of writing that led to freedom or joy, instead of just centering it all on this village that had been torn apart, and the Vikings had like done stuff, and they talked about a healing crystal, and we made a radio play together. So it was just these tools of like questioning, asking questions, making sure that you're not directing a narrative for them, that they're sort of finding the words, whatever the words are, to like describe their experience, but not just their literal experience, but an experience that they might tap into through these questions and writing and recording sounds out in nature. There's lots of ways that young people can start to like think through these bigger questions that Afrofuturism poses, and think about how they can sort of make sure it's not just a history that's being sort of framed in a particular way where there was no, where they don't see themselves at all. Like for them growing up here in Edinburgh, there's not that many other young Black children that they, not saying that they can't connect to everyone, but just people to like have a conversation with that maybe like their parents will have experienced something and they can't really tell that story with certain people. So for me, it's like, it's just been magical. I'm very honored to have worked with people who bring so much creativity through just living their own lives. And yeah, I'll put a link in the chat if people wanted to listen to them. Yeah, they're very creative and love to write, so I'll share that in the chat.
Thank you so much. We don't have any questions in the chat, and so I think it would be wonderful, since I've asked so many questions, if you have something which is burning your tongue and I haven't asked that question yet, if you could ask those questions of each other, that would be a nice way to have a final round. What would you like to know from each other?
I'm interested to know from Mae and Khadea what a kind of Afro dystopia might look like. I know we live in one anyway. But kind of in thinking about Afrofuturism as a dream, what would be the nightmare? Even worse than now. What does that look like to you? And I know it's an awful thing to imagine, so you don't have to participate in this kind of exercise, but I would like to invite you to do so anyway and share.
I think I can jump into this one, because for me, I think because I also experience my life through like a disability, which includes having night terrors, and a lot of it is a lot more to do with how society is made up, and just the fact that there are, for me, like it kind of reflects society, but for me it's more harrowing when I think about it. But it's the sense of like not hearing, or like not being able to, like not saying in the sense of like hearing as like just using our ears, but being able to hear like the cries of like the earth, the cries of people who are trying to be heard. And I always go back to this book that I read called Feeding the Ghosts by Fred Duagwa, which I read for like before Natasha Ruana's umbilic screening. And I just the way that voices are lost in this noise that I call white noise, and like I always reflect on like how the tools that I use to like reconnect to myself, so I don't get dissociated from the actual horror of like white supremacy, and like ableism, all of these like really awful things that people have made. I just sort of like I wrote about it, but I kind of feel my belly and like try to take deep breaths into it and just try to like clear the head and be just in the body again and remember like what voices I'm listening to and who like, because this white noise will make you sort of not like, you got to tune yourself to make sure you can get past that. And I think for me, like a dystopian world, which is slightly the world that I live in anyway, is a world where people who can't hear in that in a different sense, like not in the very literal sense, but can't hear the cries of like the climate, the species, the people, the just this idea of like being actually, oh gosh, I just thought about like, you know, the Get Out film, just being like sort of like, instead of sunken, you're kind of like hearing everything. Maybe I need to write a script for like a horror film, and which is actually much more reflective of society than I'd like. But yeah, that's where I was thinking.
Okay, so we're going into our last couple of minutes. Mae, can you help us to round this up? I think your view of dystopia will hold in it actually everything else. So
yeah, I mean, what you just said there, Khadea, about that disconnectedness, I think that is terrifying. And I think for me as well, it's amnesia. So you're disconnected from the memories. You don't know who you are and you don't know where you came from. And, you know, that is obviously, that's part of the plan of genocide, you know, to take away the name, take away the language, take away the culture. But it does still survive in tiny pockets, or it transfers, it transmits, it transmutes. But I think if we were to have a kind of amnesia to not understand where we came from, I think that would be the scariest thing of all, to not remember who we were or who our people are.
okay, well, that is all that we have time for, really. We have a very interesting question just coming in about Afrofuturism and feminism, and I'm so sorry that I just don't think we're going to be able to address it. I think we can continue this conversation. The program goes on, and so I really just wanted to thank all of our brilliant panelists for this conversation, and thank Natasha and Tomio for curating the program, and the Glasgow Film Theatre for hosting it. And I see you're getting answers. You're getting answers in the chat. Thank you. Octavia Butler, I love Octavia Butler. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for speaking with us, and sharing so much of yourselves with us. And hope to connect with you offline as we all continue our activities.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks, Clementine.
Thank you so much.